Hi, and welcome back to Nature in Your Neighborhood. I'm Stephanie, and we are going to talk about Diamondback Terrapins today on this episode. So Diamondback Terrapins are a fairly interesting species. They're the only type of turtle that spends their whole life in the salt marsh or in brackish water. So these are traditional turtles. So you can see they have a hard shell on them. They're covered in scales. They lay eggs. They live in brackish water. And brackish water is a mixture of ocean water and fresh water coming in from our rivers, which mixes together and is called brackish. So here on the Georgia coast, we have lots of that habitat in our salt marshes where these different types of waters mix together. So these turtles have adapted to living in that environment. Because of that brackish water, the salt level changes throughout the day, so they've adapted to living in that. They have other adaptations that make them great for living in this environment, and that is, as you can see as she's moving, are her legs, or her feet. She has really strong back legs for swimming. Also, you'll notice that her back legs and her front legs are webbed. She has extra skin in between each of her toes that allows her to paddle through the water. Also, there are claws, which you can see pushing against me right now. Those claws help them swim, help them walk, and especially on females, help them dig egg chambers when it's that time. All terrapins are kind of unique in their patterns that you find on their heads. This one has lines mixed with dots. Some have more lines. The coloration also changes per species, as well as the color of their scales and scutes on the back of their shell. So terrapins can be found from the Gulf of Mexico all the way up to Cape Cod, and living in these brackish marsh environments. So Diamondback Terrapins actually have different sizes depending on which gender they are. In my one hand right here, this is a female. They can get 8 to 10 inches across their carapace, or their top part of their shells, versus the males that can only are about 4 to 5 inches across that same shell that they have here. This is also a great example of how different their colorations can be depending on the different individuals. You can see this male, he's much darker and he has more lines on his head, and his overall shell is a darker coloration versus female, who is a little bit lighter than you can see. But other than that, they look pretty similar. So you might be curious about what these animals eat. So in the salt marsh, there's lots of food for them to find, and they use their beak as a crushing palate to catch those different foods. Here in Georgia, the most favorite food of these animals are fiddler crabs, which are very abundant, and those periwinkle snails that grow on the spartina grass in the salt marsh. But they can also eat lots of other types of crustaceans that they find, and fish, and lots of other types of mollusks like clams or mussels, depending on where they live and what is the most abundant. So they're pretty opportunistic with the different foods that they eat. Most people will never really see a diamondback terrapin since they spend most of their time in the water. The one exception is this time of year right now. In the late spring, early summer is when these animals have to come out to lay their eggs. And like other turtle species, they need to come out above the water line, or above the high tide line here in the salt marsh, in order to lay their eggs, because the eggs need to be able to get air, and if they're laid in the water, they can actually drown. So these females will come out, and they are looking for a nice sandy spot above the high tide line. And so normally they would come out and lay their eggs. They can lay between 2 and 3 clutches or nests per season of eggs, and there's a big range about how many eggs each nest will have. They can have as little as 4 or over 20 eggs in each of those nests. And then it takes between 65 and 75 days of incubation, or days just sitting in that nest, for them to develop before those baby terrapins come out of their nest. And while they're in there is actually when it gets determined if they're going to be a boy or a girl. So they are temperature dependent on what they're going to be. So if it's hot in that nest, they're going to be girls, and if it's cool in that nest, they will be boys. So it can depend on, each nest can have a mixture, or depending how much sunlight those nests get will determine what comes out of that. So what can we do to help terrapins? As I said, this is the time of year that they come out to lay their eggs. And if you have noticed crossing any of our causeways or streets here in Georgia or other parts, you can see signs that say turtle crossing. And this is the species they're talking about. Since those females have to come out, they're looking for areas above the high tide line. And many of great nesting habitats happen to be right next to roads since they're built higher up to avoid flooding. So if we do see a terrapin crossing the road, what should we do? Well, first of all, if it can safely cross the road, you should let it cross the road and don't bother it. Also, however, if it is a dangerous situation, you should be very careful before approaching one of these animals or trying to help it. But if you do, you should always pick up a terrapin or any type of turtle from the back half and use 2 hands firmly, because they will try to push you off and that can make you do it. So you need to hold them with 2 firm hands from the back, and don't go near their head because they can bite. They are an animal. And then you always want to bring them in the direction that they are going. Turtles are smart. They like to go one way. So if you bring them back to the way they came from, they will just immediately turn around and cross again. But again, only do this if it's safe to you and if you're comfortable doing it. One other way you guys can help terrapins is that if you like to go crabbing and use crab traps like this one, to make sure that yours has a turtle excluder device on it. So terrapins are normally very attracted to crab traps like this one because in the center it's full of good stinky smelly fish that they might be attracted to, and also the crabs that you're trying to catch or something that they might like to eat as well. So if you have one that has a TED or a turtle excluder device on it, it prevents this terrapin, as you can see, from getting inside, but still allows blue crabs that you're after to still get inside. So this is a best practice you can to help terrapins. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Nature in Your Neighborhood, where we focus on Diamondback terrapins. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them on our Facebook page or on our YouTube channel, and we'll be happy to answer that. And we hope to see you again in another episode soon.